Margaret Roman had worked at the Pierson County Historical Society for nearly 15 years. She had cataloged thousands of photographs. She had seen portraits of stern pioneers. She had seen images of harvest festivals and town parades. She had seen faces from a century ago staring back through glass and time. Most were ordinary. Most told simple stories. But in the spring of 2024, Margaret found something that was not ordinary at all. The photograph came from a box labeled Misc Town Events, 1899-1903. It was a glass plate negative. The image showed the Red River Valley Schoolhouse in 1901. Children stood in rows. A teacher stood to the side. The building was simple wood. The day appeared bright. Everything looked normal. Everything looked exactly as it should. That is what Margaret thought at first. The Pierson County Historical Society had started a digitization project. Old glass plates were being scanned at high resolution. The goal was preservation. The goal was access. Margaret was checking each scan for quality. She looked for cracks in the glass. She looked for damage to the emulsion. She moved her cursor across the screen. She zoomed in to check the details. Then she stopped. In the back row of children, half hidden behind another student, was a face. It was not like the other faces. The features were distorted. The lighting seemed wrong. The texture looked different. Margaret leaned closer to her monitor. The face stared directly at the camera. The expression was unsettling. It did not look like a child from 1901. It looked like something else entirely. Margaret pulled the physical glass plate from storage. She examined it under a lamp. There was no crack. There was no water damage. There was no peeling of the emulsion. The anomaly was not damage. It was part of the original photograph. It had been there since 1901. It had been captured by the camera on that day. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She printed the digital scan. She took it to Josiah, the town historian. Josiah specialized in local genealogy. He knew the families. He knew the stories. He had traced bloodlines back to the founding of the county. Margaret placed the photograph on his desk. She pointed to the figure in the back row. Josiah put on his reading glasses. He studied the image. His expression changed. Josiah pulled the original attendance rosters for the Red River Valley Schoolhouse. The rosters were handwritten. They listed every student enrolled in 1901. The schoolteacher had been Ms. Agatha Marsh. She kept meticulous records. Josiah began to match names to faces. He started with the front row. The children were easier to identify there. He moved to the second row, then the third. He worked methodically. He cross-referenced family photographs from the same era. Every child in the front rows was identified. Most of the children in the back rows were identified as well. But the figure that Margaret had found was not on any roster. There was no student registered at the school who matched that face. There was no child who should have been standing in that spot. Josiah looked up at Margaret. His face was pale. This was impossible. The photograph had been taken by Ezekiel Thorne. He was a traveling photographer. He passed through small towns in the early 1900s. He took portraits for families. He took photographs of businesses. He took school photographs. His work was his livelihood. Josiah found records of Ezekiel in the local newspaper archives. The photographer had advertised his services. He had taken photographs at the town fair. He had photographed the opening of a new hardware store. There was no indication that Ezekiel was a hoaxer. There was no suggestion of trickery in his reputation. Margaret and Josiah decided they needed expert help. The photograph was too strange. The mystery was too deep. They sent the high-resolution digital file to Dr. Kenneth Barlow. He was a forensic imaging specialist. He analyzed historical photographs for museums and archives. He looked for signs of tampering. He looked for signs of manipulation. He had decades of experience. If anyone could explain the anomaly, it was him. Dr. Barlow began his analysis immediately. He examined the film grain. He studied the light and shadow. He looked for inconsistencies. In the early 1900s, a popular fraud was spirit photography. Charlatans would use double exposures to add ghosts to images. They would use composite printing. They would create fake supernatural scenes. Families paid good money for photographs of their deceased loved ones. Was this photograph a hoax? Was Ezekiel Thorne part of that tradition? Dr. Barlow searched for signs of double exposure. A double exposure would create a faint overlay. It would show two scenes merged together, but this photograph showed only one scene. The anomalous figure was isolated. It was not a part of a second image bleeding through. Dr. Barlow examined the edges of the figure. He looked at how it interacted with the children around it. The analysis was precise. The conclusion was clear. This was not a double exposure. Josiah went back to the newspaper archives. He searched for any mention of Ezekiel Thorne and spiritualism. He found nothing. The photographer had a reputation for straightforward work. He was known for his technical skill. He was known for his honesty. There was no motive for him to create a hoax in a simple school photograph. There would have been no profit in it. There would have been no reason. Dr. Barlow considered other possibilities. Could it be a smudge on the lens? Could it be a defect in the glass plate? He examined the image at the pixel level. A smudge would affect multiple areas. A defect would show a consistent pattern. But the anomaly was localized. It was precise. It was contained to one spot. The film grain around the figure was consistent with the rest of the photograph. This meant the object was physically present. It was in front of the lens. It was part of the scene. The light on the anomalous figure was wrong. It did not match the light on the other children. The shadows fell differently. The highlights were in unusual places. Yet the figure was sharp. It was in focus. It existed in the same plane as the students around it. Dr. Barlow wrote his preliminary report. The object was real. It was photographed. But its nature was unknown. Margaret posted the photograph on the Pierson County Historical Society blog. She wrote a brief explanation. She asked for help identifying the figure. She hoped someone in the community would recognize it. She hoped there was a simple explanation she had missed. Within 2 days, the post went viral. The internet exploded with theories. Forums dedicated to the paranormal picked up the story. Social media shared the image thousands of times. Comments flooded in. People claimed the figure was a ghost. Local legends surfaced. Stories about the Red River Valley Schoolhouse began to spread. Some said a child had died in a blizzard in the 1880s. Some said the school was built on cursed land. Some said the figure was the spirit of that lost child, captured by accident on film. The ghost theory gained momentum quickly. Users shared elaborate backstories. They claimed to have found records of a child named Rose who had frozen to death walking home from school in 1887. They said her spirit haunted the building. They said she appeared in mirrors and windows. They said she whispered to children who stayed late. None of these claims had any historical basis. None could be verified. But the stories spread anyway. Other theories were even stranger. Some claimed the figure was a time traveler. They pointed to the distorted features. They said the anomaly looked too modern. They said the unsettling expression was out of place for 1901. They said the blur was caused by temporal displacement. They said the photograph was proof of something beyond our understanding of physics. One popular thread claimed the figure showed signs of digital corruption. This made no sense. The photograph was taken decades before computers existed. But logic did not slow the speculation. A third group of theorists focused on the technical aspects. They suggested the camera had captured something from another dimension. They talked about thin places where reality overlaps. They talked about moments when the veil between worlds grows weak. They claimed that old cameras, with their long exposures, could sometimes record things the human eye could not see. They said this was evidence of a parallel world bleeding into ours. Margaret and Josiah were overwhelmed. The attention was intense. The theories were absurd. They stopped reading the comments. They stopped answering emails from paranormal investigators. Television producers contacted them. Podcasters wanted interviews. A production company offered to make a documentary. Margaret declined them all. She knew the truth was out there. She knew it was not supernatural. She just had to find it. Josiah continued his research into the students. He created a spreadsheet. He listed every child who attended the Red River Valley Schoolhouse in 1901. He gathered birth records. He gathered death records. He traced families forward through time. He found descendants still living in the area. He contacted them. He asked for family photographs. He asked for stories about their ancestors. One descendant was particularly helpful. Her name was Julia. Her great-grandfather had attended the school. Julia had boxes of old family papers. She brought them to the Historical Society. Josiah went through them carefully. There were letters, there were receipts, there were report cards, there were several photographs. One showed Julia's great-grandfather as a young boy. He was standing with other children. Josiah recognized some of the faces from the schoolhouse photograph. This confirmed identifications he had already made. Julia mentioned that her great-grandfather had kept a diary. The diary was brief. Most entries were only 1 or 2 sentences, but it covered the years 1900 to 1903. Josiah asked if he could read it. Julia agreed. She brought the diary to his office the next day. Josiah read through the diary carefully. Most entries were mundane. They described chores. They described weather. They described visits from relatives. But one entry, dated September 1901, caught his attention. It read, "School photograph today. Tiago played a trick. Teacher was angry later." Josiah's heart raced. This was the first mention of anything unusual happening on the day the photograph was taken. He showed the entry to Margaret. They both understood its significance. Something had happened during the photograph. Something involving a student named Tiago. Josiah went back to his roster. He found Tiago Brennan. The boy had attended the school in 1901. He was in the back row of the photograph. Josiah looked at the schoolhouse image again. He identified Tiago's position. The anomalous figure was directly in front of Tiago. It was between Tiago and the camera. This was progress. But it did not explain what the anomaly was. It did not explain what trick had been played. Margaret and Josiah decided to take a different approach. They decided to ignore the noise. They decided to go back to the physical evidence. Not just the photograph itself, but everything around it. Margaret returned to the archive. She pulled the box labeled Misc Town Events 1899-1903. She had only looked at the schoolhouse photograph before. Now she examined every glass plate in the box. There were images of a town fair. There were photographs of a new hardware store. There was a portrait of a prize-winning cow. All were normal. All were exactly what they appeared to be. Margaret worked slowly. She held each plate up to the light. She looked at the content. She checked for any connection to the schoolhouse. Most plates were clearly unrelated, but she examined each one anyway. She was determined to be thorough. She was determined not to miss anything. Then Margaret found another plate. It was near the bottom of the box. It showed a local family. They stood in their yard. The photograph was posed. The parents stood in the back. The children stood in front. Margaret held the plate up to the light. She could see the detail even without scanning it. One of the children was holding something. She placed the plate on the scanner. The image appeared on her screen. Margaret zoomed in. The child on the left side of the photograph was a young boy. He held an object in front of his chest. It was a mask. The mask was crude. It appeared to be made of papier-mâché. The surface was painted. The face was grotesque. It had exaggerated features. The eyes were large and uneven. The mouth was twisted. It looked like something made for a play, or perhaps for a folk festival. Margaret stared at the mask. Her heart began to race. She opened the schoolhouse photograph in a second window. She placed the two images side by side. She zoomed in on the anomalous figure. She zoomed in on the mask. The features matched. The shape matched. The painted details matched. The anomalous figure was not a face. It was the mask. It was the same mask. Margaret printed both images. She ran to Josiah's office. She laid the prints on his desk. She pointed to the mask. She pointed to the anomaly. Josiah looked at both images. He looked back and forth. His eyes widened. He understood immediately. The mystery was solved. Josiah examined the family portrait more carefully. He needed to identify the family. He needed to know who owned the mask. The photograph showed 5 people, 2 adults and 3 children. Josiah compared the faces to his database of local families. He recognized the father. It was Samuel Wickham Sr. The boy holding the mask was his youngest son. His name was Samuel Wickham Jr. Josiah went back to the attendance roster. He focused on the children in the back row of the schoolhouse photograph. He found Samuel Wickham Jr. on the list. Samuel stood in the back row. He stood next to Tiago Brennan. Josiah found records of Samuel in the local newspaper. The boy had been mentioned twice. Once for winning a spelling competition. Once for breaking a window at the general store. Samuel Wickham was known as a troublemaker. The conclusion was clear. Samuel had brought the mask to school. He had held it up during the photograph. It was a prank. It was a moment of mischief. Miss Agatha Marsh would have been furious if she had known. But the prank worked. Ezekiel Thorne captured it on film. The mask was frozen in time. It was preserved for over a century. It became an anomaly. It became a mystery. But it was only ever a joke. Margaret sent the new images to Dr. Barlow. She explained her theory. Dr. Barlow ran a new analysis. He examined the mask in the family portrait. He compared it to the anomaly in the schoolhouse photograph. The match was undeniable. He examined the lighting again. He examined the blur. He understood now. The camera used in 1901 would have required a long exposure. The shutter speed was slow. The children had to stand very still. If Samuel held the mask up during the exposure, even a slight movement would create blur. The painted surface of the mask would reflect light differently than human skin. This explained the strange highlights. This explained the unusual shadows. The paint was likely white or light-colored. It would have bounced more light back to the camera. This created the unnatural glow around the anomaly. The distortion was not supernatural. It was purely photographic. It was the result of motion and material. It was chemistry and physics. Nothing more. Dr. Barlow examined the edges of the mask in both photographs. The craftsmanship was consistent. The same paint strokes appeared in both images. The same irregularities in the papier-mâché surface were visible. There was no doubt. It was the same object. Dr. Barlow wrote his final report. The anomalous figure was a mask. It was held by Samuel Wickham Jr. during the photograph. The movement and the reflective paint created the distortion. There was no hoax by the photographer. There was no ghost. There was no time traveler. There was only a child playing a prank. The report was detailed. The report was definitive. The mystery was over. Margaret updated the Pierson County Historical Society blog. She posted the family portrait. She posted the comparison images. She explained the discovery. She explained the conclusion. The internet response was mixed. Some people were disappointed. They had wanted a ghost. They had wanted something unexplainable. Others were relieved. They appreciated the rational explanation. They appreciated the detective work. Some commenters refused to accept the answer. They claimed Margaret was part of a cover-up. They claimed the mask explanation was too convenient. They continued to insist the figure was paranormal. But most readers understood. Most readers appreciated the thorough investigation. Most readers found the real story more interesting than the ghost story. The photograph of the Red River Valley Schoolhouse became a teaching tool. Margaret used it in presentations about historical research. She used it to explain how we interpret old images. She used it to show how easy it is to see what we want to see. We project our fears onto the past. We project our wonders. We look for the impossible. But often the truth is simpler. Often the truth is more human. Margaret also used the story to teach about research methods. She emphasized the importance of context. She emphasized the importance of examining all available evidence. The answer was not in the photograph itself. The answer was in the box beside it. The answer was in the diary entry. The answer was in the school roster. Historical research requires patience. It requires thoroughness. It requires looking beyond the obvious. Josiah continued to research Samuel Wickham, Jr. He found more records. Samuel had lived a long life. He married in 1915. He had 3 children. He worked as a clerk at the railroad office. He died in 1968 at the age of 75. There was no indication he ever knew his childhood prank had become famous. There was no indication he ever spoke about the schoolhouse photograph. The joke was forgotten by everyone except the glass plate itself. The children in that photograph are long gone. Ms. Agatha Marsh is long gone. Ezekiel Thorne is long gone. But Samuel Wickham's joke survives. It survives in the archive. It survives in the digital scan. It survives in the countless shares and discussions online. A small act of rebellion, a moment of mischief, a child holding up a mask for just a few seconds. That moment became legend. That moment became mystery. That moment reminds us that history is made of human choices. History is made of human impulses, even the smallest ones. Margaret still works at the Pierson County Historical Society. She still catalogs photographs. She still scans glass plates. She knows now to look deeper. She knows to check every image in the box. She knows that context is everything. The schoolhouse photograph sits in a frame on her office wall. It is a reminder. It is a lesson. The past is not always what it seems. The past requires investigation. The past requires patience. And sometimes the past is simply a child playing a joke that lasted 120 years. The story reminds us to question what we see. The story reminds us to look for evidence. The story reminds us that mysteries can be solved, not with speculation, not with wild theories, but with careful research, with attention to detail, with a willingness to examine everything. The Red River Valley Schoolhouse photograph is no longer an unexplained anomaly. It is a documented prank. It is a piece of history. It is a story about how photographs freeze time. And how sometimes they freeze mischief as well.